Hello everyone and welcome to another Endgame episode with Coach B and MasterChess.com. In this video, we're going to go over one of the most occurring type of endgame, which is the bishop of opposite colors. Understanding this type of endgame is crucial, not only because it happens very often, but also because there are many opportunities to get a draw, even down 2 or more pawns. In this video, we will go over the important positions that you need to know and identify when you can get a win or when a draw can be achieved. These theoretical positions will show us some ideas that can be applied to endings with even more pawns on the board. So let's get started. And we will start directly with positions where one side is 2 pawns up. With just one pawn, endings are very simple. If the bishop can attack any of the squares in the pawn's path, the game is drawn. For example, in this position, if it's black to move, this game is easily drawn. After bishop to b4, black controls the square e7, and there's nothing that white can do here to push for a win. As soon as the pawn marches to e7, the bishop will sacrifice for the pawn, and the game is drawn. So coming back, we will look at positions where the side with the advantage is 2 pawns up. And we will divide our study into positions where we have connected pawns and separated pawns. This video will focus on having connected pawns. And the rule is this: if you have 2 connected pawns on the 6th rank next to each other, this will always win except when they are rook and knight's pawn and the defending bishop waits on the long diagonal. So in this first position, white has 2 connected pawns next to each other on the 6th rank, so white is totally winning. However, you need to play this position correctly. Any advance of any of the pawns will actually draw here. If white will push the pawn to f7 check, after king to f8, this position is drawn. All black needs to do is keep the bishop on this diagonal, and as soon as the pawn marches to e7, he's going to be able to capture that pawn, and he will draw the game. Coming back, pushing the pawn to e7, it's also a draw. Here, black can simply capture on e7, and after f takes 7 and king takes e7, this game is drawn. Coming back from the very beginning, the correct play is starting with bishop to b5 check. And now the black king is forced to move either to f8 or to d8. The 7th rank is controlled by the pawns on the 6th rank. And it doesn't matter which option black chooses. The goal here is to have the white king support the pawn push to e7. The white king will either need to support it from d7 or from f7. Well, if here black moves the king to f8, then white will need to go to the square d7 with the king. So the correct play will be king to d5, after something like bishop to a3, king to c6, bishop to b4, king to d7, and now white can support the pawn push to e7. After something like bishop to c5, the pawn will be able to march to e7 check. After the bishop captures the pawn, white will be able to capture back as the white king defends the pawn now, and after king to f7, the pawn will promote and white will win the game. Coming back after bishop to b5, if the black king will move to d8 instead, well, now the white king will be able to go to f7 to help the pawn push to e7. So the correct play will be king to f5, bishop to c5, king to g6, bishop to b4, king to f7, bishop to c5. Now white will be able to push the pawn to e7. After the bishop captures the pawn, white will be able to capture back. And after king to c7, white will promote the pawn, winning the game. And this next position is a similar position. However, black's bishop here attacks the pawn on f6. If white plays the same way, let's say bishop to b5, say the king moves to f8, here white has to be super careful. He cannot use the same technique as getting the king to d7, because after king to d6, here the bishop could take on f6, and now this is a drawn endgame. The bishop just needs to stay on this long diagonal, and as soon as the pawn reaches e7, the bishop will sacrifice for the pawn, reaching a draw. However, coming back after bishop to b5 and king to f8, white is totally winning. What white needs to do is move the king to f5 here. And now black doesn't have many options. If he retreats the bishop, let's say bishop to a5, after pawn to e7 check, king to f7, the pawn will promote and white will win the game. Coming back, the only other option that black has is moving the king to g8, but here white is winning as well. After pawn to e7, the pawn will promote on the next move, so if the bishop captures the pawn, white will simply capture back and he will still promote, winning the game. And next, we're going to take a look at the only position where a draw can be achieved when the opponent has two connected pawns on the 6th rank next to each other. As we mentioned in the beginning, if these pawns are a rook and a knight pawn next to each other, and the defending bishop is on the long diagonal, black can achieve a draw. So here, after bishop to d5 check, the correct response is king to f8. After this, white can try king to e6, and now black simply needs to wait, bishop to b2. There's absolutely nothing that white can do. His king cannot make any progress as he's being opposed by the black king. The light square bishop cannot attack the black king. So the only other options he has is either pushing the pawn to h7 or pushing the pawn to g7. If he pushes the pawn to h7, well, here after king to g7, this position is totally drawn. White cannot make any progress. All black needs to do is simply wait on the long diagonal with the bishop, and white cannot make any progress. Coming back after bishop to b2, if white tries moving the pawn to g7 check, this also doesn't work because simply the black bishop can capture the pawn on g7. After h takes g7 and king takes g7, a draw is achieved. And coming back from the very beginning, after bishop to d5, we saw that the correct response is king to f8. Moving the king to h8 in the corner, this is actually a terrible mistake and white is winning this game. After king to h8, white can move the king to e6, and now there's nothing that black can do to prevent white from winning. If he moves the king to g8 to prevent the white king from moving to f7, well, now after king to e7 check, the black king is forced into a corner again. He cannot move to f7 anymore as the white king protects that square. And after king to h8 and king to f7, white is slowly winning. All black has is simply keeping the bishop on the long diagonal, let's say bishop to c3. But after pawn to g7 check and bishop captures on g7, white can capture the bishop back, and since the king defends that pawn, he's able to win. After king to h7, white will promote the pawn, winning the game. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video. I encourage you to stay tuned for the next video where we're going to take a look at the connected passed pawns on the 5th rank and behind. In the meantime, I encourage you to visit my website masterchess.com where you could play these positions against the computer. All you have to do is click on Endgame versus computer, opposite color bishops, and then you could play against the computer. Alright, thank you and have a great day.